Hey there, before you close your eyes tonight, imagine this. You were born in a time where streets were filled with rot instead of light, where a knock on the door could mean war or disease, where bread was rare, water could kill you, and sleep was the only safe place left. In the world of medieval Europe, it wasn't about living well, it was about not dying badly. They say history is written by kings, but what about the girl who grew up beside a plague cart, the mother who boiled grass for soup, the man who was buried while still breathing because no one dared check twice? Tonight, I want to tell you their stories, not the ones gilded in gold, but the ones whispered under thin blankets, where hope was smaller than a candle and twice as fragile. Don't worry, we'll go slow. Just you and me and the parts of the past too quiet for textbooks. So settle in, let the present fade, and let me show you the places in history where you would never want to wake up. And in one of those places, the air didn't move. Not because it was still, but because it had no room left to breathe. Medieval cities grew like tumors around castles and trade roads, swelling faster than they could be managed. Walls were built, then rebuilt, then ignored. Streets narrowed to paths, and paths shrunk to slits between wooden walls that leaned in toward each other like tired men. People lived elbow to elbow, shoulder to shoulder, and sometimes two families to a room the size of a pantry. The roofs that kept out the rain also kept in the heat, and the stink, and the smoke from half-dead fires. Every corner of a house was used, including the ones shared with livestock. Chickens inside, a goat, if you were lucky, and in some towns, the pigs, yes. The pigs slept where the children did, because warmth didn't ask for dignity. Chamber pots overflowed by dawn. They were emptied with one quick toss out the window and a prayer that no one was walking below. The streets, if you could call them that, became rivers of waste. Not all towns allowed paving stones. Some believed the filth would drain better if the streets were left bare. But all that meant was mud in the summer and disease in every other season. Most houses had no windows, just slits cut in the wall, covered with oily cloth or animal skin. Sunlight came in weak and distorted, and so did the noise horses, knives, babies, priests, beggars. But it wasn't the sounds that troubled most people. It was the air, heavy, thick, almost sour. Some said you could smell a fever before it broke, or rot before it touched the skin. And there are writings old, brittle ones that describe entire streets where no birds sang. Some say that's just a poet's touch. Others aren't so sure. Historians still debate whether the stench of those early cities was simply discomfort, or something closer to death made permanent. But they agree on this. If you were poor and born inside those walls, there was almost no escape, no field to run to, no bath to wash it away, only breath after breath of someone else's sorrow. And with every breath drawn inside those tight walls, something else crept in too. The streets weren't just narrow, they were alive. Not with people, but with things that crawled. Flies thickened the air by midday. Rats danced between your feet. Dogs feral, gaunt, and hollow-eyed gnawed bones beside rotting turnips. Waste flowed like water through the alleys. And not just human waste, the blood from butchery, the offal from kitchens, the birth and death of livestock. It all ran into the same gutters, if gutters even existed. There was no organized sewer system, just sloped ground and hope. Hope that the rain would wash it away. Hope that someone else would slip on it first. In some places, people laid straw over the worst patches. It didn't clean the street, it just covered the filth with something softer to step on. But the worst wasn't what you saw. It was what you smelled, and what came next. When summer came, the stench rose. But in winter, it settled thick, moist, clinging to the inside of your nose like wet cloth. Some townsfolk believed the stink could kill you, that it wasn't disease itself, but the very smell of decay that invited death into the lungs. They hung sweet herbs in doorways, burned dried rosemary. Some soaked linen in vinegar and pressed it to their mouths, but most couldn't afford such things. So they endured, and here is something you might not know. In the worst corners of the slums, they sometimes used stale urine aged for days to scrub wooden floors. It broke down grease, and they said the smell of ammonia was preferable to everything else. There's still debate about how effective these methods were. Some scholars argue that the use of urine may have reduced certain parasites. Others believe it was more superstition than sanitation. But imagine walking through those streets, feet slick with someone else's morning, eyes stinging from smoke, rot and ash, and always stepping aside for the cart. Not the one full of goods, but the one that carried silence. covered with a blanket, pulled by tired hands. Another body, another neighbor. No ceremony, just a narrow path, and room enough for the dead to pass through. And just beyond those alleys, where the carts stopped rolling, the ground became quieter still, not because it was clean, but because it was full. In many towns, the cemetery wasn't somewhere far away behind iron gates. It was your neighbor, your backyard, sometimes your foundation. Graveyards grew wherever they could, behind chapels, between workshops, beside water wheels. And when space ran out, the earth was reused, old bones unearthed, set aside, sometimes stacked neatly, sometimes not. There are records, quiet ones, carved faintly into stone, of children playing beside open graves, chasing each other between headstones worn smooth by time and tears. Some families lived with the dead not metaphorically, but literally. There are accounts of homes built partially on burial soil, of cellars dug into consecrated ground, of walls made from stone that had once stood over someone's final sleep. One strange truth: in certain parishes, builders used bones long, white, and already cleaned by time to reinforce door frames or shore up collapsing wells. They weren't trying to be cruel. They were being practical. Wood was expensive, stone was rare, but death was common. Some villagers even believed bones brought protection, that keeping the dead close would remind the living how to behave. Historians still debate whether this reuse of the dead was an act of desperation, reverence, or simply forgetfulness dressed in ritual. But what's certain is that sleep was never too deep in those homes. You could lie in bed and hear wind across a mound outside your wall, or dream of footsteps in soil that had once held silence. A child might be born in a room where someone else had died. A table might stand on planks that covered a grave no one remembered. And as dusk fell and the hearth dimmed, stories whispered through the walls about shadows in the garden, names no longer spoken, and a thin, familiar voice that came when everyone else had gone to sleep. But there were places where even the whisper of your name was enough to empty a room. Leprosy, not the sudden kind, not violent or loud, but slow, creeping, a disintegration, piece by piece, not just of the body, but of memory, of identity, of place. Once spotted, you were given no trial, no discussion. You were taken or told to go beyond the edge of town, to where the dirt paths broke into brush and silence. There, a new place waited. Not quite a village, not quite exile. A cluster of makeshift huts, rough chapels, gardens that tried but rarely grew. These were the leper colonies, and their names are mostly lost now, because no one wrote them down. The people inside didn't consider themselves cursed. They built, shared, tried to remember what normal used to mean. Some even married. A few gave birth. And in some rare places, they made rules. Rules about food, about song, about prayer. They were building life from the scraps of abandonment. And if you walked past one of those hidden lanes, you might hear a voice singing, not beautifully, but earnestly. Not everyone feared them, though. There were farmers who left bread on fence posts, children who whispered stories they weren't supposed to hear, and priests who came not to judge, but to listen. Still, the bell had to be rung. That was the rule. If a leper approached town, they carried a bell or clapper, a sound to announce, "I am near, I am danger," even when all they wanted was cloth, or oil, or a single kind word. Some rang it with pride, others with trembling hands. A few refused choosing, instead to disappear into woods no one patrolled. And yet, these people kept journals, letters, carved their names into wooden beams. Some historians still argue whether these colonies were prisons or sanctuaries. But the people inside, they planted trees, they taught one another to laugh again. And when the wind blew just right, their prayers drifted back toward the towns that had once cast them out, as if to say, "We remember you, even if you chose to forget us." And still, the bell rang, sometimes soft, like a child testing the air, sometimes harsh, like someone who no longer cared how loud the silence around them had grown. It wasn't made of gold or silver. Of course, just hammered iron, cold in the morning, heavier by dusk. The lepers didn't choose the bell. The town did. It was their warning system, a line that didn't exist in maps, but lived in ears. The moment that sound drifted toward the village square, shutters closed, curtains dropped, and the earth seemed to tilt slightly away. Some towns even made the infected wear special robes, brown or gray, with markings sewn into the sleeve, not so different from other robes, except that no one would ever mistake you for anything else. A few were kinder. Some towns let the lepers come to market at dusk. When the square emptied, they could walk the perimeter. Goods were left on stone steps, coins placed in vinegar buckets. No one spoke, but things were traded. And yet, a line remained. Not drawn in chalk, not guarded by soldiers, but as real as any wall. That line lived in stares, in coughs that stopped too quickly, in greetings that faded mid-syllable. There are stories of lepers who returned, years later, healed, or at least changed. They stood outside churches they once entered as children, and waited for someone to open the door, but no one did. And here's a strange thing. In a few forgotten villages, that bell, the same one meant to mark exclusion, was eventually hung in chapels, rung for births, for weddings, for the dead. Some historians suggest this was a gesture of redemption. Others believe the bell was simply reused. Its past unspoken but not unknown. But what no one debates is this. The bell, no matter who rang it, always sounded the same. But not every threat came with a bell. Some rode in with dust trailing behind hooves. Others crept quietly with the night steel in hand, breath held tight, eyes glowing with orders they didn't question. The borderlands, they called them not the lines you see on modern maps. These were softer, blurrier, sometimes shifting by the week. One year, your village belonged to this kingdom. The next, a different flag hung in the wind. For those who lived there, loyalty wasn't a matter of pride. It was a matter of survival. Bread baked for the soldiers passing through. Wine surrendered before it could ferment. Daughters kept hidden. Sons sent to higher ground. If war didn't come one day, it was a kind of blessing, but no one dared call it peace. The thatched roofs were burned and rebuilt so many times. The straw never dried properly. Doors were reinforced with whatever wood could be found, sometimes using broken carts, old plows, even the pews from abandoned chapels, and under the floorboards, hiding spaces. Not for gold, but for silence. The kind of silence you needed when marching feet came too close. Some families carved trapdoors beneath their beds. Others dug shallow pits in pig pens, reasoning that no soldier would look for a crying child beneath a layer of manure. Strange, isn't it, that in some corners of the world, filth was safer than firelight? There are letters old and brittle describing villages that vanished overnight. Not burned, not erased, just emptied. Their names removed from memory out of fear that remembering might bring war back again. Historians still discuss whether these borderlands were truly forgotten, or simply buried too deep in the noise of conquest. But for those who survived, those who sat by ash-covered hearths and waited for someone not wearing armor to knock, home was never walls. It was the moment when no sound was the safest sound of all. But even when the fire stopped, the leaving didn't. Some walked barefoot for days. Others rode carts missing wheels. A few carried what they could, loaves wrapped in cloth, the ashes of a grandfather, or the rusted key to a door they might never return to. War didn't always kill. Sometimes it simply unrooted. Fields that once bloomed became battlefields. Wells were poisoned, fences trampled. A village might fall not in flames, but in whispers. They're coming. And then no one stayed to see if it was true. The path forward wasn't marked. It was guessed. People followed rivers, followed stars, followed hope. But mostly, they followed whoever didn't stop walking. There's one story, quiet and never confirmed, of a girl named Amara. Her village burned while she was gathering herbs in the hills. When she returned, the smoke was still fresh, but no bodies, no voices, just footprints heading north. She followed, alone. For 12 days, at dawn on the 13th, she found her brother, asleep in a hay cart beside strangers. He didn't speak when he saw her. He just took her hand. Historians still debate the scale of these migrations. How many fled? How many were lost? How many became someone new in some other land? But in church records and land rolls, you'll find strange gaps. Names struck through, villages listed, then never mentioned again. And in some old song, a lullaby passed from mouth to mouth. You'll hear a melody that doesn't match the words, because it didn't begin where the singer was born. It came from somewhere else, somewhere they had to leave, to stay alive. But not every village burned. Some were left untouched by war, only to be undone by the sky. There was a year they called the long rain, another the silent spring, and then the year with no name, because the crops didn't grow, and neither did the children. In many places, the bread stopped rising before the sun did. The mills slowed, then stopped. And famine quiet, patient, cruel took its place at every table. People pulled bark from trees, boiled nettles, moss, roots too bitter to chew, and when even that was gone, they chewed linen, softened in broth made from rocks. There's one account passed from a monk to a scribe to a whisper of a woman who boiled her leather shoes. 3 days, until the soul softened enough to bite. No one judged her, because she shared. Her child ate first, and when asked how it tasted, he said, like something that used to be alive. Historians still debate the true causes of the great famines. Was it climate, over-farming, sin, but in the hearts of those who endured? The reason mattered less than the hunger. Feasts became forced. Prayers replaced suppers. Even the church grew quiet. Because how do you bless a meal that no longer exists? And still, people waited for the sky to clear, for green to return, for a single day without the sound of someone collapsing mid-step. And when that day finally came, no one celebrated. They just slept longer. Because starvation steals more than flesh. It takes dreaming, too, and it takes a long time to dream again. Even when the bread comes back, and even when the famine faded, the hunger didn't. For most peasants, dinner was not a ritual. It was a hope, one bowl, maybe two, of thin pottage oats. Water, salt if lucky. Sometimes a cabbage leaf. Sometimes nothing. Meals came when the sun dipped. Not because it was tradition, but because that's when work finally ended. And when your body was too tired to care what it ate, families gathered around a shared pot. Not to eat together, but to eat it all. Children went first, then the elderly, and if there was still steam rising, the ones who toiled in the fields got what was left. Meat was rare, a rumor, almost, unless it was a feast day, or unless something had died naturally or otherwise. Some tried to make flavor out of smoke, pressing dried herbs into the crust of old bread, scraping pans for anything with taste. Others dreamed instead, they'd lie down on straw mats, bellies warm but empty, and fall asleep, imagining roasted birds, thick stews, golden apples. Because sometimes, imagining a feast was all you could afford. And here's something you may not know. In certain villages, mothers would heat smooth stones and wrap them in cloth to place at the feet of sleeping children. Not to warm them, but to distract them from hunger. Historians still wonder if this practice was a widespread tradition, or something passed down only through desperate memory. But it worked. The warmth tricked the mind, and the child dreamed, if only for a while, that they were full, and in that dream, there were no empty bowls, only candlelight, and the sound of someone saying, "Eat as much as you like, there's more." And what of water? You'd think it was safe, clear, flowing, cold on the tongue, but in medieval towns, water was more riddle than relief. Rivers were lifelines until they became sewers. Wells were sacred until they soured. The stream behind your home might shimmer at dawn, and poison you by dusk. In many places, water had no guardians. It collected runoff, the waste, rot from tannery to butcher, from bathhouse to burial ground. And so people turned to ale, not the hearty drink of tavern songs, but something weaker, lighter than soup, heavier than silence. They called it small beer, brewed with low alcohol, just enough to kill the things water couldn't. Children drank it, elders depended on it. There's a story of a midwife who refused to bathe a newborn in water. She warmed beer instead, said it smelled safer. And perhaps it was. Some families brewed daily, using the same grains over and over. By the third run, it was nearly flavorless. But it wasn't water, and that was enough. Still, illness came, fevers that started in the gut, mouths too dry to speak. Historians still argue how much death flowed through those rivers. How many lives ended not by blade or famine, but by a single sip. And yet, water remained holy. It was blessed, poured over heads in baptism, collected in jars for healing. Even as it killed, it cleansed. That contradiction ran deep, like the well in the center of a village. Quiet, dark, and full of things you couldn't quite name. And then the air changed. It wasn't just foul, it was fearful. People said they could feel death before they saw it. A shadow in the corner of a street, a silence in the market where a child used to laugh. And then the coughing began. Black Death, they whispered, though no one knew its name at first, only that it came quickly and didn't leave. First, the swellings, then the fever, then the quiet. It moved without mercy from dock to alley. From priest to peasant, people stopped touching, stopped burying, stopped hoping. The churches rang bells each morning, not to gather, but to count one toll for each death. Sometimes, the bells didn't stop. In some towns, so many died in 1 week that names were written in the chalk on doors, not to honor the dead, but to warn the living. There's an account half remembered, half song, of a man who rang the bell for his wife, then his children, then himself. Historians still argue how the plague began. Rats, ships, punishment from heaven. What they agree on is the number, too many, and the silence afterward, so many voices gone that even the wind sounded lonelier. In one village, the blacksmith carved crosses for each house that lost someone. By spring, there were more crosses than walls, and yet people still lit candles, still fed the sick, still pressed damp cloths to burning skin, even when they knew what it meant, because even death, when faced with kindness, slowed down, if only for a moment. But when death stayed too long, people began looking for someone to blame. Not the rats, not the wells, but the women with herbs, the men who walked alone, the cats that stared too long at nothing. In fields once meant for harvest, fires were lit, not to warm hands, but to burn names. They whispered witch, and in whispering it, they believed it. Women who knew how to make poultices gone, men who knew when to plant by moonlight gone. The sick were told to confess, not of sin, but of knowing too much, knowing how to stop bleeding, knowing how to help a cow give birth. And so, knowledge burned beside ignorance, but not everywhere. In some villages, people still clung to both faith and root work. The priest would bless the bread, the healer would add chamomile. Together, they hoped one curious truth. In certain parishes, protective charms were buried beneath chapel thresholds. Bones of toads, iron nails bent in prayer, herbs sewn into linen. Not forbidden, not holy, just necessary. Historians still debate whether this blending of magic and religion was survival or superstition. But in the faces of those who kept vigil, no one seemed to care what label the help wore. If it worked, even once, it was sacred. There's an old tale of a village that placed bread on each windowsill, one slice for the living, one for the dead, and one for whatever passed in between. No one touched the middle piece, not even the birds. And maybe that's all magic ever was. Not control, not illusion, just a ritual made from fear and the wish that something might listen. And high above the fields, past the slums and silent villages, the castle stood, stone towers, tall gates, velvet banners fluttering in the wind. But even there, the air grew still. The plague didn't care for titles. Hunger didn't ask for land deeds. Kings choked like farmers. Queens buried children just like milkmaids did. In some estates, entire dining halls were emptied overnight. The gold plates stayed polished, but the chairs were never filled again. One story, half record, half rumor tells of a baron who insisted on holding a feast during the plague. He ordered roast boar, honeyed pears, sweet wine and goblets heavy enough to bruise. And before the meal ended, he collapsed. Not from poison, but from the peaches, overripe, unwashed, carried in from a village already marked by illness. His last words, "It tasted perfect." Historians still argue whether the rich truly suffered during these times. They had stores, walls, servants, but what they lacked was trust. Because when food was short, every servant was a question, every cough an omen. Some nobles fled their own estates, hiding in monasteries dressed as commoners. Others locked their gates, letting even friends starve outside. And there were those rare but remembered who opened their stores, gave bread to the fields, built hospitals beside chapels, shared what they had. Not because they had to, but because they still believed that kindness could outlive fear. And in a few dusty corners of ruined keeps, carvings remain, not of dragons or battles, but of hands, holding, giving, remembered. But perhaps the saddest places were not the ones filled with death, but the ones where no one died, because no one remained. Villages vanished, not burned, not buried, just uninhabited. A door left ajar, a ladle still hanging, a game of stones half finished beneath a crooked bench. People walked away, one family, then three, then the baker, then the priest. And soon, only the trees knew the stories. These places didn't make the maps, or if they did, they were scratched off later, too small to matter, too empty to explain. Yet their names lived on, in lullabies, old songs passed between generations. Not as history, but as melody, a soft tune hummed while shelling peas, or weaving, or rocking a child who could not sleep. And when asked, "What does that song mean?" the answer was often, "I don't remember. My grandmother sang it, But somewhere in the refrain, there was the name of a village, a real one, now lost. Historians still debate how many communities disappeared completely. Some believe hundreds, others far more. But in the old church ledgers, where years are listed and names recorded, there are gaps, not ink blots, not torn pages, just silence. The kind of silence that once was a choir, a schoolyard, a wedding toast. And now is only wind moving through empty doorways, over stone steps no one climbs, through windows that remember warmth, but no longer hold glass. And if you stop to listen, really listen, sometimes that wind still carries a tune. And somehow, through war, through hunger, through silence and fear, people kept sleeping, not always well, not always safely, but they lay down, on straw, on stone, in barns, in beds too narrow for dreams. And even when everything else was taken, their land, their children, their names, the body still sought rest. You see, sleep was the one mercy that never had to be begged for. And in the stillness of those long, dark nights, mothers hummed to babies too hungry to cry. Lovers whispered promises, not of riches, but of waking up together. Old men traced prayers in the air, their fingers trembling from cold or memory. And all across the kingdom, from crumbling villages to towers wrapped in ivy, someone, somewhere, was exhaling, softly, and letting the day go. Historians don't write about this part. They record battles, famines, plagues, but they rarely note how bravely people slept, how they carried grief under blankets, how they tucked away hope like coins under pillows, how they dreamed, even when there was no food, no fire, no future, just a single breath, hissed, and then another. So now, as you lie in your own bed, surrounded not by smoke or silence, but by the gentle hum of life, let those stories wrap around you, not to frighten, not to weigh heavy, but to remind you that rest has always been sacred, that even the poorest, the loneliest, the most forgotten, laid their heads down too, and found, if only for a few hours, a kind of peace. So, close your eyes. You've heard enough for tonight. Let the past fade, like the last coal in a hearth, glowing soft. And still, sleep well.